My name is Tessa, and I spent 20 years being the reliable daughter, the one who stayed quiet so my brother could shine. But last Tuesday I said 4 words and my father's $1.2 million retirement plan collapsed like a house of cards. My father, Silas, didn't just expect me to fund his golden years. He had already signed the paperwork using my name as the sole guarantor for his luxury mountain villa. He looked me in the eye and said, "Family carries each other, Tessa. It's your turn." My mother, Martha, just nodded, already picking out curtains for a guest room I'd never be invited to. They thought I'd stay silent just like always. But I didn't. I made one phone call to the bank's compliance officer and said those 4 words. What happened next didn't just cancel his mortgage. It exposed a decade of financial lies that reached all the way to my brother Leo's successful startup. By the time the sun went down, the moving trucks were canceled and my father's reputation was in ruins. Before we continue, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Now let me take you back. I grew up in a house where silence wasn't just expected. It was the currency we used to pay for my father's ego. My father, Silas, was a man who viewed his family not as individuals, but as supporting characters in the epic of his own life. He worked as a senior consultant for a high-end firm, a job that afforded us a life of manicured lawns and prestigious zip codes. But behind the heavy oak doors of our home, the atmosphere was one of calculated performance. Everything had to look perfect. If the neighbors saw a crack in the veneer, it was a failure on all our parts. Then there was my brother, Leo. In my father's eyes, Leo was the crown prince. Every achievement Leo had, no matter how small, was celebrated with champagne and expensive gifts. When Leo decided to launch a tech startup that essentially burned through cash with no product in sight, Silas didn't blink. He funneled money into it like he was watering a prize-winning rose. Meanwhile, I was the reliable one. I was the daughter who got the scholarships, the one who worked 3 jobs to put myself through law school so I wouldn't burden the family, and the one they called whenever a faucet leaked or a bill needed explaining. My mother, Martha, acted as the enforcer of this dynamic. She wasn't cruel in the traditional sense, but she was a master of the guilt trip. To her, keeping Silas happy was the only way the family survived. If I ever complained about the disparity between how Leo and I were treated, she would sigh, pat my hand and say, "Tessa dear, you're strong. You don't need the help. Your brother, he's sensitive. He needs us." For years I accepted this. I built my own life, a quiet but successful career in corporate compliance, and I kept my distance. But everything changed 6 months ago when Silas announced his grand retirement vision. He didn't want a quiet life in the suburbs. He wanted a legacy. He had his eyes on the Summit, an exclusive gated community in the mountains where the entry fee alone cost more than my first home. He spoke about it at every Sunday dinner, describing the heated floors, the wraparound deck, and the wine cellar. He talked as if the money was already in the bank. The first red flag appeared 3 months ago. Silas called me into his study, a room I was rarely invited into, and laid out a thick stack of papers. "Tessa," he said, his voice dropping into that patriarch tone he used when he wanted something. "I'm finalizing the purchase for the Summit. But because I'm technically retiring, the bank is being difficult about the liquid assets. They need a secondary guarantor. Someone with a high-stability professional profile. Someone like you." I felt a pit form in my stomach. "Dad, that's a $1.2 million property. I have my own mortgage, my own life. I can't put my credit on the line for a luxury villa." He laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "It's a formality, Tessa. I have the funds in my private investment accounts. I just need your signature to bypass the red tape. You wouldn't want your father to spend his final years in a common neighborhood, would you? After everything I've provided for you." Martha chimed in from the doorway. "Think of it as a family investment, honey. When we pass, it'll go to you and Leo anyway." I knew deep down that going to me and Leo meant Leo would live in it and I would pay for it. I told them I needed time to think. But Silas didn't give me time. He gave me a deadline and then he did the unthinkable. I found out through a casual notification from my credit monitoring service. A hard inquiry from a private wealth bank. Then another. When I logged in, I saw it. An application for a high-interest bridge loan in the amount of $450,000, listing me as the primary applicant and Silas as the co-signer. He hadn't waited for my signature. He had forged it using my personal data he'd kept in his family files for years. He didn't just want a guarantor. He was using my identity to fund the down payment because his own accounts, the ones he boasted about, were actually empty. He had drained his retirement to keep Leo's failing startup afloat for the last 3 years. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the fact that he was willing to bankrupt my future to maintain the illusion of his past. He expected me to see the family first banner and march right off the cliff for him. I sat in my apartment that night looking at the digital trail of his fraud. I could have called him and screamed. I could have begged him to stop. But I knew Silas. He would gaslight me, Martha would cry about my lack of heart, and Leo would pretend he didn't know where the money was coming from while driving his brand new company car. They thought I was the same quiet girl who would sacrifice her peace for their comfort. They had no idea that my job in corporate compliance had taught me exactly how to dismantle a lie of this magnitude. I didn't call my father. I didn't call my mother. I waited until the following Tuesday, the day the final closing documents for the villa were set to be notarized. I let him believe he had won. I let him imagine himself sitting on that mountain deck. And then I picked up the phone. I called the one person who could stop the clock. The chief compliance officer at the lending bank, a woman I had worked with on a joint audit 2 years prior. She picked up on the second ring. "Tessa? Long time no see. What can I do for you?" I took a deep breath. My hands weren't shaking anymore. "I'm calling regarding the loan application for the Summit property. My name is on the file." "Oh yes," she said, checking her screen. "We're just about to clear the final disbursement. Is there a problem?" I said the 4 words that ended my father's charade. "I didn't sign that." The silence on the other end of the line was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. It was the sound of a $1.2 million dream hitting the pavement from a great height. I stood in my kitchen, the cold linoleum pressing against my bare feet, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel like the quiet daughter. I felt like a landslide. "Tessa," the officer finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Are you saying the electronic signature on the bridge loan from 2 days ago wasn't yours? It was verified via your personal email." "My father has access to my old childhood laptop," I explained, my voice as cold as the air outside. "The recovery email for that account is his. He didn't just forge a signature. He hijacked my digital identity to bypass your security. If you disburse those funds, you are participating in a federal crime." I hung up. I didn't need to say more. In my line of work, once you flag a transaction for identity theft, the bank's legal department moves faster than a shark that smells blood. But I wasn't done. Silas had spent 20 years teaching me that family meant protecting his secrets. Well, it was time he learned what happens when those secrets are brought into the light. I spent the next 4 hours at my dining table turning it into a war room. I pulled every digital receipt I had. I downloaded 5 years of family update emails where Silas had bragged about his private investments. I cross-referenced them with the public filings of Leo's tech startup, AITA-style. What I found was even worse than I imagined. Silas wasn't just using my name for a mountain villa. He had been using Martha's medical trust, money set aside for her hip replacement and long-term care, to pay the lease on Leo's office space. He had created a web of lies so tangled that he'd started believing them himself. At 6 p.m. the explosion began. My phone lit up with 42 missed calls in 10 minutes. The group chat, usually reserved for photos of the neighbors' dogs or Martha's recipes, became a stream of vitriol. "Tessa, call the bank now. They've frozen my private accounts. Tessa, how could you? Your father is having a heart palpitations." You're ruining the Aura Cloud merger, Tess. Fix this or I'm suing. I didn't reply. I walked into Silas's study an hour later, carrying a thick manila folder, the golden folder. The scene was pure chaos. Silas was pacing the length of his mahogany desk, a glass of scotch in one hand and a phone in the other. Martha was curled on the velvet sofa, weeping into a silk handkerchief. Leo was there too, looking like a cornered animal, frantically typing on a laptop that Silas had probably paid for. "You're here," Silas roared the second the door clicked shut. "Tell me you called them. Tell me you told the bank it was a technical error." "I told them the truth, Silas," I said, dropping the folder onto his desk. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "I told them I didn't sign it. And because you used my name as a guarantor, they've started a full audit of every account linked to that application. Which means they're currently looking at the private accounts you've been using to hide Leo's losses." Silas stopped pacing. His face went from purple to a ghostly, sickly white. "You have no idea what you've done. That villa. That was the legacy. That was for all of us." "No," I said, stepping closer. "That was for you. You wanted to sit on a mountain and look down on everyone while I spent the next 30 years paying off the $450,000 bridge loan you took out in my name. You were going to bankrupt me before I even hit middle age, all so Leo could keep pretending he's the next Mark Zuckerberg." Leo jumped up, his voice cracking. "Aura Cloud is a real company, Tessa. We're weeks away from a Series A." "Leo, sit down," I snapped. "I saw your filings. You have 3 employees and 0 revenue. You've been paying yourself a $150,000 salary using Mom's medical trust money. Silas, did you tell her? Did you tell Martha that the money for her surgery is gone because Leo needed a founder's retreat in Cabo?" The room went deathly silent. Martha stopped crying. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide and searching. "Silas? The trust. You said it was in a high-yield bond. You said it was safe." Silas didn't look at her. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like heat. "You're a traitor. We gave you everything. We gave you a name, an education, a family. And you repay us by calling the police on your own blood." "I didn't call the police, Dad. I called the bank. You're the one who committed the crime. I just refused to be your accomplice." "You're going to call them back," he hissed, moving toward me. "You're going to tell them you made a mistake. You're going to save this family, or so help me." "Or what?" I challenged him. "You'll disown me? You already did that when you decided my financial life was a sacrifice you were willing to make. You'll stop inviting me to Sunday dinner? Good. I'm tired of the food and I'm tired of the lies." I pointed to the folder. "In there is the proof of the forgery. I've already sent a digital copy to my attorney. If you try to use my name for so much as a library card, those documents go to the DA. The mountain villa is gone, Silas. The bank has already canceled the disbursement. The sellers are going to sue you for the lost earnest money, and frankly, you deserve it." Martha started to wail again, but this time she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Silas like he was a stranger. Leo was still staring at his laptop, realizing that the Aura Cloud dream was over. Without Silas's forged loans, there was no more runway. There was no more pretend. "For words, Silas," I said, turning toward the door. "I didn't sign that. Those 4 words are the only thing standing between me and the $1.2 million hole you tried to bury me in. And I will say them every single day if I have to." I walked out of the house. As I reached my car, I could hear the screaming start. Not at me, but the sound of a family finally turning on itself because the one person who usually held the pieces together had finally let go. The reliable daughter was gone. And in her place was a woman who was finally, legally and beautifully, free. The silence that followed my call to the bank wasn't a void. It was a workshop. For 30 years, Silas and Leo had treated me like a silent ledger, a place to record their debts and store their secrets. They viewed my reliability as a form of weakness, a guarantee that I would never look too closely at the hand that fed me. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. My job in corporate compliance wasn't just a title I wore to the office. It was a philosophy. I was trained to find the ghosts in the numbers, the tiny discrepancies that signal a collapsing empire. I didn't just sit in the dark of my apartment. I went into a cold, clinical state of discovery. I pulled out my old childhood laptop, the one Silas had insisted on servicing for me 3 years ago when I moved out. He thought he was being a helpful father, but I realized now it was a Trojan horse. He hadn't realized that while he was busy using my old email accounts to bypass security questions and forge digital signatures, I had already set up a silent administrative mirror of every outgoing message. As I scrolled through the logs, the receipts began to pile up on my screen in a horrifying, beautiful sequence. I watched the digital trail of Silas's desperation. I saw the emails he had sent to the mortgage brokers at the wealth management firm, attaching PDFs of my pay stubs that he had crudely edited to show a salary 3 times higher than my actual earnings. He hadn't just forged a signature. He had manufactured a version of me that existed only on paper to secure a $1.2 million luxury villa. But the trail went deeper. I found an encrypted folder labeled Family Assets. Inside, I didn't find bonds or stock certificates. I found a series of frantic communications between Silas and a man named Marcus. My father's emails were pleading, almost pathetic. Marcus, I discovered through a quick search of the firm's metadata, wasn't an investor in Leo's startup or a cloud. He was a high-interest private debt collector. Silas had borrowed against Martha's medical trust to pay back Marcus, and when that ran dry, he had turned to me as his final nuclear option. Then I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally whose authority was beyond question. I didn't call the police yet. I knew that once the law gets involved, you lose control of the narrative. I needed someone who could strike from within the family. I called my great-aunt Evelyn. In our family, Silas liked to pretend he was the king, but Evelyn was the bank. She was a retired forensic accountant who had survived 3 recessions and 2 divorces without losing a single cent. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper questions. She had always been a strong ally to me, the only one who noticed when I was passed over for Leo at every holiday. "Tessa," she said, her voice crackling with a cold, sharp intelligence that immediately calmed my nerves. "I've been watching Silas play this game of musical chairs for 5 years. He's been draining your mother's trust to keep that boy's ego inflated, hasn't he?" "Worse, Aunt Evelyn," I replied, my voice hard. I felt the injustice gap closing as I spoke. "He used my name as the sole guarantor for a $1.2 million villa at the summit. He forged my signature on a bridge loan. I have the metadata. I have the IP addresses. And I have the transfer logs showing every dollar of Mom's surgery fund going into Leo's private crypto wallet to cover his business expenses." "Send it all to me," she commanded. "I'm coming to the retirement celebration dinner tonight. Silas thinks he's celebrating a new beginning. We're going to make sure it's an ending. And Tessa, bring that manila folder. Don't leave a single page at home. It's time we give the audience the show they've been waiting for." I spent the rest of the afternoon in a fever dream of preparation. I printed every bank statement that showed the unauthorized transfers. I printed the emails where Silas told the bank I was excited to help the family. I printed the screenshots of Leo's social media posts where he bragged about founder life, while the money for his mother's hip replacement was being liquidated to pay for his club tables. I organized them meticulously into a thick, heavy manila folder. In the world of viral storytelling, this folder is more than paper. It is the physical manifestation of the truth. It was the weight that would finally balance the scales. The curiosity gap was closed for me, but Silas and Leo were still operating in the dark. They thought they had successfully gaslit the quiet daughter one last time. They were currently at the restaurant, likely ordering the most expensive champagne on the menu, unaware that the reliable daughter was no longer working for the family. She was working for justice. I checked the time. The dinner was at 7 p.m. I had 1 hour to transform from the victim into the prosecutor. I didn't want to just stop the loan. I wanted to reveal the rot so completely that they could never hide behind Family First again. I picked up the folder. It was heavy. It was real. And it was the only thing I needed to bring Silas's $1.2 million house of cards down for good. I headed to the car, my heart pounding with a mix of terror and a new sharp kind of joy. The discovery phase was over. Now it was time for the receipts. The restaurant was one of those places that specialized in the illusion of success. Dim lighting, white linen tablecloths, and a wine list that read like a mortgage application. Silas had chosen the center table, right under the crystal chandelier where everyone could see him. This was his stage. He looked every bit the triumphant patriarch, leaning back in his chair, a glass of vintage Bordeaux in his hand. Martha was beside him, looking relieved as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. And then there was Leo, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, checking his watch with the bored arrogance of a man who thought he'd just won a lottery he didn't even enter. They didn't see me walk in. I was carrying the golden folder, tucked under my arm, pressing it against my ribs like a shield. I felt a surge of the injustice gap. That psychological drive to see a massive wrong finally righted. For years I had been the invisible daughter, the one who worked 3 jobs and got the scholarship so I wouldn't burden them, while Leo was the golden child who got the cars and the bailouts. Tessa! Silas boomed, his voice carrying across the room as I approached. You're late. We've already started on the appetizers. Sit down, sit down. We were just toasted to the new family legacy, the mountain villa. The bank called me this afternoon. There's some small paperwork snag, but I told them you'd clear it up first thing tomorrow. I didn't sit. I stood at the head of the table, the folder resting on the white cloth. It's not a snag, Silas. And I'm not clearing anything up. The table went silent. Leo looked up from his phone, his lip curling. Tess, don't be dramatic. We're at dinner. Just do your job and fix the compliance flag. Dad needs that bridge loan to close the deal before the weekend. That's the thing, Leo, I said, my voice low but cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. I did my job. As a corporate compliance officer, it is my duty to report fraudulent activity. So I called the bank and told them 4 words. I didn't sign that. Silas's face went a dangerous shade of crimson. You did what? Do you have any idea what you've jeopardized? That villa was for all of us. It was for your mother's comfort. Was it, Silas? I reached into the folder and pulled out the first set of receipts, the bank transfers. I slid them across the table, fanning them out like a deck of cards. Then why did you transfer $200,000 from Mom's medical trust into Leo's private crypto wallet 3 weeks ago? Why does this statement show that the family investment fund is actually an empty shell used to pay back a private debt collector named Marcus? Martha leaned forward, her hand trembling as she picked up one of the papers. Silas? What is this? This has my signature on it, but I never authorized a transfer to Leo. It's a forgery, Mom, I said, looking her in the eyes. Just like the signature on the $450,000 bridge loan with my name on it. Silas hijacked our identities to fund a lifestyle none of us can afford. Leo tried to grab the folder, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. You're lying. This is all manipulated data. You're just bitter because AuraCloud is going to be worth millions and you're just a paper pusher. AuraCloud is a ghost, Leo, I countered, pulling out the public tax filings and the employee wage claims I'd printed earlier. You have 3 lawsuits pending for unpaid salaries. You've been using the house money to pay for your founder's retreats while Mom's hip surgery gets delayed because the market is down. Well, the market isn't down. The bank accounts are empty. People at the neighboring tables were beginning to turn. The public climax was reaching its peak. Silas stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Tessa, shut up. You're embarrassing this family. We can fix this behind closed doors. No, I said, my voice rising so the entire room could hear. We're done with closed doors. I spent 20 years being the kid who didn't ask for much so you could have everything. I'm done being the foundation for your lies. Aunt Evelyn. From a small table in the corner, Great Aunt Evelyn stood up. She had been sitting there the whole time, a silent witness. She walked over, her face a mask of cold, forensic fury. I've seen enough, Silas, she said, her voice like a gavel. I've already spoken to my attorneys. Since I am the primary trustee of the family estate, I am stripping you of your management rights. And as for the villa, I've informed the sellers that the guarantor was a victim of identity theft. The deal is dead. Silas sank back into his chair, the small action of my 4 words finally causing his $1.2 million world to collapse in real time. The receipts were all over the table, undeniable and grounded in reality. I picked up the folder, now lighter but infinitely more powerful. I didn't destroy this family, Silas. I just stopped being the one who had to lie to keep it together. Enjoy your dinner. I hope the champagne was worth it because it's the last thing you'll be buying with my name. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving the silence of the Injustice Gap, finally filled with the weight of the truth. The aftermath of that night at the restaurant wasn't just a family argument. It was a total structural failure of the world Silas had built. In high-retention storytelling, this is the moment of nuclear consequence, where the audience sees the irreversible damage caused by the betrayal. The injustice gap that had fueled the narrative was finally closed, but the debris left behind was staggering. For Silas, the 4 words I spoke didn't just stop alone. They acted as a digital forensic key that unlocked every door he had spent years trying to bolt shut. The first domino to fall was the legal one. Because I had used my nuclear option, notifying the bank's compliance department, the bank was legally obligated to trigger a formal fraud investigation. They didn't just cancel the $1.2 million villa. They blacklisted Silas from every major lending institution in the country. The receipts I provided, the forged pay stubs and hijacked metadata, grounded the narrative in a reality that no amount of gaslighting could erase. Within 48 hours, Silas received a notification that his primary accounts were frozen. The man who wanted to be the king of a mountain villa couldn't even use a debit card to buy a gallon of milk. Within 30 days, the status quo was completely obliterated. Silas and Martha were forced to put the family home on the market in a distressed sale, to cover the mounting legal fees and the massive earnest money penalties from the failed luxury purchase. The house where I had spent 20 years being the invisible child, the one who stayed quiet so the men could shine, was sold to a young couple who didn't know the walls were saturated with decades of secrets. Silas ended up in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the far side of town. His reputation in the consulting industry was radioactive. Nobody would touch a man whose own daughter had to flag him for identity theft. Leo's golden child lifestyle evaporated even faster. Without the constant influx of cash Silas had been draining from Martha's medical trust, OraCloud collapsed like a house of cards. The founder, who spent his time at retreats, was now facing multiple lawsuits from unpaid employees and a very angry landlord. He lost the Tesla, the downtown office, and the last shred of his unearned ego. He ended up living on a friend's couch, still sending me emails blaming me for stifling his genius. But the audience knows better. The golden child was just a parasite who ran out of hosts. My mother, Martha, finally faced the injustice gap that had existed for decades. She realized that the husband she protected and the son she adored had spent her old age and her health on a fantasy. The hip replacement surgery she needed was delayed by another year as she struggled to rebuild her medical trust from the scraps Silas hadn't touched. She eventually stopped calling me to beg for family unity, realizing that a boundary isn't an act of war, it's an act of self-preservation. As for me, the reliable child who didn't ask for much, I finally reclaimed my narrative. I realized that no, is a complete sentence and that I am not an anchor for people who refuse to learn how to swim. I didn't destroy my family, I just stopped lying to keep it together. I moved into a smaller place, one that I paid for with my own clean credit and my own real signature. Every night when I lock my door, I feel a peace that $1.2 million could never buy. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the reliable one who finally had to say 4 words that changed everything? Have you ever had to use a manila folder of receipts to protect your own future? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice and reclamation. I'm Tessa and I'm glad you're here.